Arizona Territory, July 1883, the sun baked the dust into cracks on the main road of Dry Creek, and by the time Henrietta Langley stepped off the last stagecoach from Santa Fe, her boots were coated in heat and grit. She clutched her satchel to her chest, sweat sliding down her back beneath a pale green traveling dress that was already wrinkled from the journey. Her fingers dug into the seams of the bag, empty now. Stolen. Somewhere between the stop in Fort Sumner and the final stretch, her pouch of savings had vanished. Every cent she had gone. The driver tossed her one last glance. "You sure someone's meetin' you, miss?" Henrietta swallowed hard, nodding once. "Yes, of course." But no one waited at the depot. No man stepped forward. No familiar name called out. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the few buildings: saloon, general store, sheriff's office, livery. A few horses and a couple of men drinking in the shade, but no sign of Mr. Walter Granger, the man she had written to for months. The man who promised to marry her. She stood alone. Henrietta pressed her lips together, fighting the burn behind her eyes. She had come too far to fall apart now. She had survived her mother's death, her father's debts, the Boston boarding house. She could survive this. Well, hell. The voice came from behind, deep, steady. She turned. A tall cowboy stood leaning against a hitching post, his sleeves rolled up, sun darkening his forearms. His shirt was dusty but clean. His hat shaded honest blue eyes and a face that had seen storms and silence alike. He looked to be around 30, maybe a little older. "Beg your pardon?" Henrietta asked, tightening her grip on the empty satchel. "You just stepped off that stage looking like you were trying not to faint," he said. "And from the way you keep starin' at the road, I'm guessin' whoever was supposed to meet you didn't show." She hesitated. "That is not your concern." He tipped his hat. "Name's Porter O'Malley. I work the Circle R ranch just outside town. I was only here to pick up feed, but—" "You look like you could use a hand." "I am fine," she said too quickly. Porter glanced at the satchel. "You sure?" Henrietta faltered, her chin trembling just a little. "My money was stolen, and the man I was supposed to marry. He is not here." Porter stared at her for a beat, then looked away, jaw tightening. "That's a hard thing." "I will manage," she said, lifting her chin again. "There must be work somewhere, a boarding house." "There's only one in town," he said. "It is full up. And the saloon don't rent to women." Her shoulders sagged. He rubbed the back of his neck, then looked at her steady. "Listen, I do not make a habit of picking up strangers, but I got a small cabin on the edge of the ranch. It is separate from the bunkhouse. You could stay there a while. I would not expect anything, just a roof over your head until you figure something out." She stared at him. "You would do that for me? You look like you need a place. I got one, that is all." Henrietta looked down at her boots, then back up at him. You said your name is Porter," he nodded. "I am Henrietta Langley. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Langley." The ride to the Circle R was quiet. She rode beside him on an old mare he borrowed from the livery, trailing behind his own dark gelding. The landscape stretched in soft golds and copper tones, the air dry and open. No fences, no tall buildings, just sky and earth. She had never seen anything like it. When they reached the small one-room cabin, Henrietta blinked. Weathered wood, a little porch, a bucket near the well. It was plain but clean. "You can take the bed," Porter said, tying off the horses. "I will roll out a cot in the barn." She stepped inside. The room smelled like cedar and dust. A small stove, a table, a broom in the corner, a shelf with a few books. Her throat tightened. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, turning to him in the doorway. He leaned against the frame. "Because someone should." That night, Henrietta washed in the basin and folded her dress over the chair. She lay down on the bed, staring at the wooden beams above her, listening to the wind outside and the low sounds of animals in the barn. It was the first night she had not cried since the stage ride. She thought of how Porter had kept a respectful distance the whole day. How he had not asked questions he had no right to. How he had left a tin of beans and some bread on the table before going out to the barn. The next morning she found him at the corral, mending a section of fence. "I can sew," she said, approaching him. "Cook too, clean." "I can help." He looked up from the post he was hammering. "You do not need to." "I want to," Henrietta said. He gave her a small nod. "All right." Days passed. She scrubbed the floors, hemmed a ripped shirt, made stew with salted beef and onions. Porter never lingered too long in the cabin, but he always came back from the fields by sundown. They ate together, talked a little. She learned he had no family left, that he had been working cattle since he was 16. That he had once tried to marry a girl in Tucson, but she had run off with a silver prospector. He asked about Boston, and she told him of her family's fall from grace, of the desperation that led her to write those letters to Mr. Granger. He listened without judgment. One evening he brought her wildflowers. "They grow by the creek," he said, setting them in a tin cup. Henrietta stared at them, then at him. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because I thought you might like them." She touched the petals. "I do." At the end of the second week, she stood outside while he returned from the ranch house. He swung down from his horse and paused when he saw her. "I cannot keep living in your cabin without giving you something real in return," Henrietta said, hands clasped in front of her skirt. "Not just cooking and sewing, I need something solid, something honest." He looked at her. "What are you asking?" She took a breath. "Let me marry you. You would not have to love me. I know you do not, but I could be useful and safe." Porter stepped forward slowly. "Henrietta, I do not want to marry someone out of pity or guilt." "That is not what I am asking for." He reached up then, brushing a curl from her cheek. His hand lingered there. "I will marry you," he said quietly, "because I want to, because I want you safe, and because I think I could come to love you." She met his eyes, her voice caught. "Maybe I already do." He smiled then, soft and warm, and kissed her forehead. "Then let us do it right." The air was cooler in the hills, where juniper dotted the slopes and the wind moved differently, less like a command, more like a whisper. Henrietta kept her hands tucked in her lap as the wagon creaked uphill, the weight of her new name still unfamiliar in her mouth. "Mrs. O'Malley." She hadn't said it aloud yet. Porter sat beside her, shoulders relaxed, one hand steady on the reins. His hat shadowed his eyes, but she noticed how he glanced over at her every so often, like he was still convincing himself she was real and sitting there. She understood the feeling. "You ever been on a mountain trail before?" he asked, eyes ahead. "No," she said. "Closest thing I knew was Beacon Hill, paved and full of carriages." He gave a quiet breath of amusement. "Ain't much pavement out here. I noticed." They passed a stand of pine trees, their needles sharp and dark, the smell clean and different from the dustier valley. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding over the earth in wide, slow turns. Porter tugged the reins gently and pulled the wagon to a stop beside a rocky outcrop. "Figure this is a good place to rest the mule. We're near the upper pasture. I wanted to show you something." Henrietta followed him on foot up the slope, her shoes slipping once on the loose gravel. He offered a hand, and she took it without hesitation, letting his grip guide her up the last few feet. When she stood beside him, the view opened like a secret. Below them stretched the range, green, gold, and wide, cut through with a thin, glinting thread of water. A few cattle moved slowly across the grass. Beyond them, the land rose again, soft and shadowed with distance. She didn't speak for a long moment. "I didn't know it could look like this," she said finally. He shifted beside her. "I come up here when things get too loud in my head." She looked at him. "What does it sound like in there?" He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair, then held the hat loosely by the brim. "Most days, regret, some shame. Other days, it's just work and weather." Henrietta folded her arms, the breeze tugging at her sleeves. "And now it's quieter." They stood in silence, side by side, until the wind changed. A soft snap of fabric made her turn. His shirt sleeve had caught on a branch, and he was working it free when she noticed the scar just below his elbow, long and pale against the darker skin. "What happened there?" "Barbed wire," he said. "There was a steer tangled bad in it." "Didn't wait for help." She didn't ask if it was worth it. She already knew the answer. Back at the cabin that evening, Porter lit the lantern and set it near the stove. Henrietta stirred beans over the flame, the quiet between them no longer awkward but comfortable, like a hearth warming both sides. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if things had gone different?" he asked, sitting at the table, elbows resting on his knees. "I used to," she said. "But not since I got here," he tilted his head. "Why not?" She turned from the stove and met his eyes. "Because I'm tired of mourning things that never came to pass." He nodded once, slow. "That makes two of us." After supper he walked her to the porch, the stars already sharp overhead. The night cooled quickly out here and she pulled her shawl tighter. "I'll ride to town in the morning," he said. "Pick up some nails and a hinge for that drawer that sticks." She gave a small nod. "If you see the woman who runs the post, could you ask if a letter came for me? I think I may still have one friend in New York, though I'm not sure if she remembers. I'll ask." A pause settled between them. "Porter," she said, her voice low, "I'm not afraid of being your wife, but I don't know how to be one." He reached for her hand. "You don't have to know. Just stay." She did not reply with words. She stepped closer instead, laid her head against his chest, and let the sound of his heart steady her. He didn't move at first, then slowly brought his arms around her, holding her with the kind of care that asked nothing and offered everything. Inside, the lantern's light flickered against the windowpane. Behind them, the land stretched into quiet, and the stars watched without judgment. Henrietta didn't know if she would ever write another letter to the East. But she found herself thinking, for the first time in years, that maybe she wouldn't need to. By late August, the monsoons had passed, leaving the earth firm again underfoot and the air scented with creosote and mesquite. Dust rose gentler now, and the cicadas had quieted. Henrietta stood behind the cabin, apron damp from washing, her hands raw from scrubbing clothes against the washboard nailed to a bent barrel. Porter came from the barn, carrying a bundle of fencing wire across one shoulder. His shirt clung to him in places, but he moved without hurry, like the land had slowed him into its rhythm. "You think you'd want chickens?" he asked as he set the bundle down near the shed. She wrung out a shirt and looked up, water dripping from her elbows. "If I had a way to keep coyotes off them." "I can build a coop," he said, brushing dust from his palms. "Got scrap lumber and old screen from the storeroom. I'd like that." He nodded once, then squatted beside the pile of wire and began separating lengths by thickness. She watched him a moment. "You always work this way, quiet and steady." He pulled a sliver from his palm and flicked it aside. "Only way I know, fast work breaks things." Henrietta folded the wet shirt over the line, her fingers moving slower. "I used to think quiet meant weakness or fear. But I don't anymore." Porter didn't look up. "What changed your mind? You did." He sat back on his heels, arms resting on his knees. "I'm not trying to change you, I know, that's why it's working." She turned back to the wash and he returned to the wire, both of them saying nothing more. That evening, she brought down a box from the shelf above the stove. Inside were cloth scraps, buttons, and a spool of blue thread finer than anything she could find in Dry Creek. She spread them across the table while Porter rinsed off at the pump outside. When he stepped inside, he paused at the sight. "You mackin' something?" "A quilt," she said, threading the needle. "The kind that tells a story." He pulled a chair beside her, arms crossed on the table. "What kind of story? Mine, I suppose, or now ours?" "I thought I'd stitch something for each season we live through." Porter studied the pieces. "That one there, what's that for?" He pointed to a square with a faint green print. She ran her thumb over it. "The day I arrived." "The color reminded me of the dress I wore, though it's long gone. You remember that day clear?" "I remember the heat, and how you stood like you didn't expect me to look back." "I didn't." They sat quietly, the needle moving in and out of fabric, the clock ticking faintly behind them. Later that week, Porter brought home 2 hens and a rooster, tied in burlap sacks. He built the coop in 2 days, hammering by lantern light the second night. Henrietta brought him coffee both evenings, and though neither of them spoke much, something passed between them in the quiet respect, earned without being asked for. One morning she found a folded length of cotton on the table, pale blue with white stripes. Beneath it, a note in his handwriting. It simply read, "For your next square." She traced the fabric's edge, then tucked it into her sewing box without a word. In September, she began waking before him. She'd light the stove, mix flour and lard, and set biscuits on the pan before the sun had touched the edge of the sky. He'd come in, rubbing sleep from his neck, and sit without ceremony, just a nod of thanks and the sound of coffee pouring. One morning, as she placed the last biscuit on the plate, he reached across and caught her wrist gently. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "Miss what?" "The life you thought you'd have. Boston, carriages, a house with paint on the walls." She looked down at his hand, warm and calloused around her wrist. "Not anymore," he let go but leaned forward. "Why not?" "Because I wouldn't trade this," she said. "Not for anything with lace or gas lamps." He didn't speak, but she saw it in his face, a quiet kind of astonishment, like she'd said something he hadn't dared hope to hear. That night, he didn't sleep in the barn. He rolled out his cot by the stove, and she didn't ask why. When she folded the quilt over herself, she listened to his breathing, steady and close, and felt safer than she could remember ever feeling. The next day, she stitched a small square of muslin with a single stitch of red thread in the center. When he asked what it meant, she answered without looking up. "The night you stayed." He didn't say anything, but he brushed his fingers over her shoulder as he walked past, the brief contact speaking more than words. By then, the days had shortened. Mornings came crisp, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Henrietta stood on the porch one evening, watching the sky turn amber, her fingers wrapped around a tin mug. Porter came up behind her, arms crossed as he watched the same horizon. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause, "about building a proper room on the back of the cabin. Something with space enough for a cradle someday." Her breath caught. "You want that?" He turned to her, lifting her chin with one finger. "I want everything you'll give me." She set the mug down, reached for his hand, and didn't let go. "Then start drawing the plans." He leaned down and kissed her, soft and certain, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the stage in Dry Creek, Henrietta felt like she belonged to something that wouldn't be taken from her. They stood there until the sun was gone and the crickets began their song again. The world had changed in small ways. A coop behind the cabin, a quilt on the bed, and the shape of a man's hand always waiting for hers. By early October, the first frost stiffened the grass before sunrise. Henrietta pulled her shawl tight as she stepped from the cabin, the air kissing her cheeks with cold. The rooster hadn't yet called. Across the yard, Porter was hitching the mule to the wagon, moving deliberate and quiet. She crossed to him, boots crunching lightly. "You're heading into town. Hardware stores expecting that order of nails and pitch," he said, looping the final strap. "Figure I'll stop by the post while I'm there." She nodded once. "If the ledger papers come in, we could start tracking feed costs." Porter paused, glancing at her with something unreadable behind his eyes. "You thinking of running the books?" "I've been thinking about it for weeks," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I know arithmetic better than most men in town. My father made sure of that, even when the debts were piling up." He studied her a moment, then gave a short nod. "All right, I'll ask for 2 ledgers. One for the cattle, one for the house." She reached into her apron and pressed a folded note into his palm. "If Mrs. Boyce still has ribbon, ask for this color. If not, any dark will do." He tucked it into his coat without reading it. "I'll be back by dusk." She watched him drive off, the wagon creaking over the hard-packed road. When the dust settled, she turned toward the coop. The hens were restless, pecking at the frozen ground. She scattered feed, then knelt beside the fence and began inspecting the lower slats for gaps. By mid-morning, she'd mended 2 spots with wire from the shed. Her fingers ached from the cold, but she didn't stop until the last panel was secured. She wiped her hands on her skirt and straightened, the sky above her clear and sharp. Inside, she boiled water for washing and set a loaf of bread to rise. The cabin had grown familiar in its details, the way the stove took longer to heat after a cold night, how the floor creaked near the corner shelf, the way light pooled by the window just before midday. She paused at the table, fingers brushing the quilt she'd folded there. The latest square was stitched from a scrap of Porter's old work shirt, the sleeve he'd torn building the coop. She hadn't told him. Later, she stepped into the barn to check the stores. The feed sacks were lower than expected, and the roof above the rear stall showed a thin line of daylight through one of the beams. She made a note in the small paper scrap she kept tucked in her pocket, then went to the tack wall and began oiling the reins. The door creaked open behind her. "Henrietta," she turned. The ranch foreman, Cal Dorsey, stood in the frame. He was older than Porter by maybe 10 years, his face weathered and sharp at the chin. "Morning," she said, setting the tin of oil aside. He stepped inside, removing his hat. "Didn't expect to find you out here." "I check the feed every few days," she said, wiping her hands. "Porter trusts me with the numbers now." Cal leaned against the post nearest the door. "He's not the most talkative man on the range, but he's steadier than most. I've seen him come near broke more than once and never complain." "I know the kind," she said quietly. He looked her over, not unkindly. "You've done right by him." She stood straighter. "I intend to keep doing so." He nodded once and stepped back outside. She watched him go, then returned to the tack, hands steady. The sun was low when she heard the wagon returning. She met Porter halfway down the path, brushing sawdust from her sleeves. He lifted a parcel from the seat and handed it to her. "Ribbon. Not the color you asked for, but close." She unfolded it, fingers brushing the deep plum fabric. "It'll do better than I hoped." He handed her a wrapped bundle. "Ledger paper came in, and the clerk said to tell you she remembers your handwriting from the order slip." Henrietta raised a brow. "Did she say it kindly?" Porter grinned faintly. "Said it was neater than her own." They walked back in step, the sky tinged with rose and lavender. Inside, she set the ribbon aside and unwrapped the paper. The pages smelled of ink and starch. She ran her hand over the cover, then looked up. "Was there any mail?" He shook his head. "No letters." She didn't flinch. "Then I'll stop expecting one." Porter leaned against the doorframe. "I saw Cal this afternoon back at the bunkhouse. Said you were in the barn." "I was." He said you held your own. Henrietta met his gaze. "I always will." He crossed the room to her then. "You know, I never thought I'd have anything like this." She tilted her head. "Like what?" "A home that has more than 4 walls, something that fills quiet with more than silence." She reached up, her fingers brushing his jaw. "You gave me your name before you knew me." "I knew enough." They stood there as the lantern flickered warm against the walls, the shadows soft around them. No promises were spoken. None needed saying. Outside, the cold deepened. Inside, the fire caught strong. The first snow came early that year, light and dry, drifting in from the north like a hush laid over the land. It melted by mid-morning, but left a fine crust on the roof and along the fence lines, enough to remind everyone at the Circle R that winter was near. Henrietta pulled the last of the carrots from the garden that morning, her breath white in the air. The ground was stiff but not yet frozen, and she worked quickly, wrapping the roots in burlap for storage. Porter had gone to check the southern pasture with Cal, leaving her a list of supplies to tally for the smokehouse. She'd already written down the salt measurements and the amount of hickory wood stacked behind the shed. Her fingers were stained with soil, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was holding her breath against the world. Not far off, the wind caught in the cottonwoods, branches scraping against each other like old bones. She glanced up once, then turned toward the barn to retrieve the basket of dried herbs she'd left hanging by the loft door. Inside, the air held the scent of hay, leather, and the faint sweetness of apples stored in crates near the stall. She climbed the ladder to the loft and paused halfway, hearing voices below. "You could have asked weeks ago," Cal was saying, his tone edged but not sharp. "I wasn't sure then," Porter replied. "I am now." Henrietta stilled, one hand on the rung. The air between the boards let sound carry easily. "It's your place," Cal said after a breath, "but she's a sharp one, and she's made you different." "Not different, just more settled." Henrietta waited until the steps receded before she climbed the rest of the way and retrieved the basket. On the walk back to the cabin, she let her mind turn over Porter's words. More settled. There was something in that, something that felt like the edge of a promise. That evening, after dinner, Porter unrolled a large sheet of paper across the table. "These are the plans." Henrietta leaned over beside him, studying the careful pencil lines. "You've already measured the frame this morning before the snow. I was hoping to start the foundation before the ground freezes." She traced her fingertip along the sketched doorway. "This room. It's larger than I expected." He looked at her then, quiet and direct. "I want space for what comes next." She folded her arms. "You mean children, if we're lucky." She didn't answer right away, then she reached for his hand. "I would like that." They worked together the next 3 weeks, clearing the back plot, driving stones for the corner posts, and mixing mortar. Henrietta hauled water from the pump and warmed it on the stove so the work wouldn't freeze too soon. Porter spent the evenings drafting new measurements by lantern, and she stitched more of the quilt with fabric from an old feed sack dyed pale yellow. On a morning when the frost lingered well past sunrise, she found him standing by the edge of the new foundation, arms folded, boots planted firm. She walked up beside him, hands in her shawl. "I've been thinking about a name," he said, eyes on the horizon. "For the child, for the ranch." She tilted her head. "It already has a name. Circle R belongs to the Parsons family, always did. I've been leasing this land for over 10 years. But Cal's giving up his share come spring. He's moving north to Colorado. The owners offered me the full lease." Henrietta blinked. "That's a great deal of land. I know every acre of it, and I want it to be ours, not just a place we live, a place we shape." She touched the edge of her shawl. "What would you call it?" "3 junipers," she smiled. "Like the ones at the southern ridge, they never drop their green, even in snow." That night she added a new square to the quilt, deep green with 3 small stitches in gray thread fanned like branches. By early December, the new room was framed and roofed. The wind still came in at the corners, but Porter said he'd chink the gaps after the next supply run. They moved their bed into the new space, and Henrietta arranged her sewing box on the windowsill. She placed the quilt folded across the foot of the bed, waiting for the final square. One evening she stood at the stove while Porter read a letter from the land agent. The fire crackled and the smell of venison stew filled the room. He folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "It's done. Lease's signed." Henrietta stirred the pot. "Then we'll need a new sign. I'll paint it." He came up behind her, warm hands settling on her shoulders. "You know, I used to think I'd never have anything worth keeping, just work and passing days." She turned slowly, her hand resting over his. "You have me." He kissed her then, not with urgency but with the deep, unhurried certainty of a man who'd come through weather and silence to find something true. That night, with the fire banked low and the quilt drawn up around them, Henrietta whispered into the darkness, "I feel safe." Porter pulled her close. "That's everything I ever wanted to hear." The snow came heavy by midwinter, but the walls held. The coop stayed dry, the hens laid through the cold, and the new room warmed quicker than expected. Henrietta taught herself to make preserves from the last of the autumn pears. Porter carved a cradle from pine, smoothing each edge until it fit against the wall beside the bed. In spring, wild poppies bloomed where the frost had once hardened the earth. The new sign hung on the gate, carved in simple letters, 3 Junipers Ranch. Henrietta stood beside Porter as they watched a pair of calves stumble through their first steps in the pasture. Her hand rested over her belly where the first flutter had come just days before. "I think," she said softly, "we've made a good life." Porter's arm came around her shoulders. "No. We made the right one." And together they walked back toward the house, the wind at their backs, the hills gold with light, and everything ahead of them rooted in what they'd built, side by side.